In 1935, a group of men in suits walked into a federal office in Washington and began coloring a map. They used 4 colors: green for the neighborhoods they considered best, blue for still desirable, yellow for declining, and red for the areas they judged too hazardous for investment. They colored 239 cities. They filed the maps. They stamped them confidential, and then those colors became walls. Not walls made of brick or concrete, walls made of policy. Walls made of ink and interest rates and denial letters. Walls that would determine for the next 90 years who could build wealth in America and who could not. The maps were created by the Home Owners Loan Corporation, the HOLC New Deal agency most Americans have never heard of. The language on the maps was precise, surgical even. Area descriptions included phrases like infiltration followed by specific racial and ethnic groups. Not as anecdotes, as data points, as reasons to refuse capital. And the most disturbing part is not that these maps existed. The most disturbing part is what happened after they were supposedly abandoned. The maps were not widely known to the public for decades. Historians began uncovering them in earnest in the 1990s and early 2000s, and when researchers at the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab finally digitized and published the full collection in their Mapping Inequality Project, the scope became visible for the first time in a way that allowed systematic study. 239 cities. Over 4,000 individual neighborhood assessments. Each one graded, each one annotated, each one carrying language that linked property value directly to the racial and ethnic composition of the people living there. The grading criteria were not subtle. HOLC appraisers described neighborhoods using terms that would be recognized today as explicitly discriminatory. A neighborhood in Detroit's Section D8 was described as having an infiltration of Negroes. A section of Philadelphia noted foreign-born populations as a negative factor. In Chicago, the annotations referenced the threat of infiltration from adjacent black communities as a reason to downgrade an area from yellow to red. These were not informal notes. These were standardized federal assessments produced by trained appraisers working from a common methodology developed at the national level. And the grading green, blue, yellow, red mapped with near-perfect consistency onto racial demographics. Predominantly white, native-born, upper-income neighborhoods received green ratings. Neighborhoods with black, immigrant, or mixed-race populations received yellow or red. The correlation was not incidental. It was the point. The entire system was designed to quantify a subjective judgment which neighborhoods deserved capital and which did not, and then dress that judgment in the language of objective risk assessment. The word hazardous on those maps did not mean flood zones or fire risk. It meant people. Specific people. And the lending patterns that followed those maps would shape American cities for the rest of the century. But here is where the first layer of the pattern begins to reveal itself. These maps were supposed to be internal documents. They were classified. They were not intended for public circulation, and yet their influence spread far beyond the HOLC itself. To understand how a set of confidential government maps became the invisible infrastructure of an entire economy, you need to understand what the American housing market looked like in the years between 1934 and 1968. The Federal Housing Administration, the FAR, was established in 1934, 1 year before the HOLC began its mapping project. The FAR's job was to ensure private mortgage loans, reducing risk for banks and making home ownership accessible to millions of Americans for the first time. This was the engine of the post-war middle class. GI Bill loans, FAR-insured mortgages, the explosion of suburbia, all of it ran on the same fuel, federal backing that made 30-year, fixed-rate mortgages possible. But the FAR had its own underwriting manual, and that manual, particularly its 1938 edition, recommended that loans should not be insured in neighborhoods where incompatible racial groups were present. The manual explicitly endorsed the use of restrictive covenants, legal clauses attached to property deeds that prohibited sale or rental to non-white buyers. The FAR did not simply decline to invest in redlined areas. It actively channeled investment away from them and toward racially homogeneous white suburbs. Between 1934 and 1962, the FAR insured over $120 billion in home loans. Less than 2% of that money went to non-white borrowers. The HOLC maps provided the framework, the FAR provided the money, and the private lending industry, banks, savings and loans, insurance companies followed both. By the late 1940s, the pattern was locked in. A family living in a green-rated neighborhood could secure a federally insured 30-year mortgage at favorable rates, build equity, and pass that wealth to their children. A family living in a red-rated neighborhood could not. Not because of their income, not because of their credit, because of the color on a map that they were never allowed to see. And this was happening in every major American city simultaneously. Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Baltimore, St. Louis, Cleveland, the same color system, the same racial criteria, the same outcome. Different local governments, different local banks, different local populations. Identical structural result. By 1950, the wealth gap between white and black American families had become a chasm, not because of individual choices, but because of a system of capital distribution that used race as its primary variable while calling it risk. Now a second pattern emerges, and it interlocks with the first in a way that makes the full picture considerably harder to dismiss as historical accident. The maps did not just determine who got loans, they determined where infrastructure went, where highways were built, where public housing was placed, where environmental hazards were concentrated, and where they were not. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Federal Aid Highway Act funded the construction of the Interstate Highway System 40, 1,000 miles of highway that reshaped every major American city. The routes those highways took were not neutral. In city after city, the highways were routed directly through red-rated neighborhoods. In Miami, Interstate 95 was driven through the heart of Overtown, a thriving black business district. Before the highway, Overtown had a population of approximately 40,000. After construction, it had fewer than 10,000. In St. Paul, Minnesota, the construction of Interstate 94 destroyed the Rondo neighborhood, the center of the city's African-American community. Over 600 homes were demolished. In Syracuse, New York, Interstate 81 was elevated directly over the 15th Ward, another predominantly black neighborhood, physically dividing it from the rest of the city. These were not coincidences. The HOLC maps and the highway routing maps, when overlaid, show a degree of correspondence that urban planning researchers at the University of Minnesota and the University of Connecticut have documented extensively. The neighborhoods that received the lowest investment grades were the same neighborhoods selected for highway construction, public housing projects, and industrial zoning. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing. Redlining reduced property values. Low property values made neighborhoods politically easier to condemn through eminent domain. Condemnation made room for highways. Highways further depressed the value of surrounding properties. And the residents displaced by this cycle, overwhelmingly black, overwhelmingly without the capital to relocate to green-rated suburbs, were concentrated into increasingly smaller, increasingly underfunded areas. Public housing was placed in these same zones. Robert Moses in New York, Richard J. Daley in Chicago, the power brokers of mid-century urban renewal chose locations for public housing that reinforced the boundaries the HOLC maps had drawn 2 decades earlier. The Pruitt Ego Housing Project in St. Louis was built in 1954 in a neighborhood that had been redlined in 1937. It was demolished in 1972, its failure cited as evidence that public housing itself was unworkable. But the failure was engineered long before the first tenant moved in, engineered by the systematic denial of investments, services and infrastructure to the very ground it stood on. The second pattern is this. The maps did not merely reflect existing conditions. They created the conditions they claimed to describe. And then those conditions were used as evidence that the original assessment had been correct. This is where the two patterns converge, and the convergence is where the real weight of the story sits. The HOLC maps created a grading system based on race. The FAR translated that grading system into lending policy. Private banks followed the federal lead. Highways and public housing reinforced the boundaries. And then, and this is the part that rarely gets discussed with the specificity it deserves, the tax base followed the money. Green-rated neighbourhoods, flooded with federally backed mortgage capital, grew, their property values rose. Their tax revenues increased. Those revenues funded schools, parks, hospitals, fire departments, road maintenance, and water infrastructure. Red-rated neighbourhoods, starved of capital, contracted, their tax revenues fell. Their schools were underfunded. Their infrastructure deteriorated. Their residents, unable to access conventional credit, turned to contract buying, a predatory system in which a buyer paid monthly installments to a seller who retained the deed until the full price was paid. Miss a single payment, and you lost the house and every dollar you had put into it. Beryl Satter, in her landmark study Family Properties, documented how contract buying in Chicago transferred an estimated $500 million from black families to white speculators between 1940 and 1970. Adjusted for inflation, that figure exceeds $3.5 billion. That wealth did not disappear. It was transferred from families who could not access federally insured mortgages to speculators who could. From red zones to green zones. From one side of the colour line to the other. The human cost is not abstract. A 2020 study by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition found that 74% of neighbourhoods that were redlined in the 1930s remain low to moderate income today. 64% remain predominantly minority. 90 years later, the lines held, not because laws didn't change. The Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968. Not because overt discrimination continued in its original form. The lines held because wealth compounds. Because a home purchased with a 30-year mortgage in 1948 in a green-rated suburb generated equity that funded a child's college education, which funded a career, which funded another home. And a family denied that mortgage in 1948 started the same generational timeline at zero. Every year that passed widened the gap. Not through active malice, through math. The official narrative is that redlining ended. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 made racial discrimination in housing illegal. The Community Reinvestment Act of 1977 required banks to serve the communities where they were chartered. The HOLC maps were declassified. The FAR revised its underwriting standards. Case closed. But the revision of the narrative happened in a way that deserves closer examination. When the HOLC maps were declassified and eventually made available to researchers, the institutional response was not to conduct a systematic audit of their lasting effects. It was, for decades, to treat them as historical curiosities, artifacts of a less enlightened era, regrettable but resolved. Academic study of the maps was sparse until the mid-2000s. The Mapping Inequality Project at the University of Richmond, which made the full collection publicly accessible and searchable, was not launched until 2016, 81 years after the maps were drawn. For 81 years, the primary documents of one of the most consequential federal programs in American history were effectively inaccessible to the public whose lives they had shaped. And during that same period, new mechanisms emerged that replicated the redlining pattern without using its language. Predatory subprime lending in the early 2000s was disproportionately concentrated in formerly redlined neighbourhoods. A 2010 study by the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago found that zip codes that had been redlined in the 1930s experienced significantly higher rates of subprime lending between 2004 and 2007, and significantly higher rates of foreclosure during the 2008 financial crisis. The same neighborhoods, the same outcome, different mechanism. The language of exclusion evolved. Hazardous became high risk. Infiltration became credit score. The maps were gone. The pattern was not. And when those subprime loans collapsed, the wealth destruction fell, once again, disproportionately on the communities that the HOLC had coloured red 70 years earlier. The destruction was not random. It followed the lines. Insurance companies used similar geographic models. Environmental regulators cited waste facilities and industrial zones using zoning maps that carried the fingerprints of the original grading system. A 2022 study published in the journal Environmental Science and Technology Letters found that formerly redlined neighbourhoods have significantly higher levels of air pollution, fewer trees, and higher average surface temperatures than neighbourhoods that were graded green or blue, even within the same city. The maps shaped the land itself. And the land remembers. If you walk through a formerly redlined neighbourhood in Baltimore today, say, the area around Pennsylvania Avenue that the HOLC graded D in 1937, you can see the line. Not on a map. On the ground. The housing stock changes within a few blocks. The tree canopy thins. The sidewalks shift from maintained to cracked. The density of boarded windows increases. Cross into what was a B-rated neighbourhood, and the change is visible within 200 yards. Researchers at Johns Hopkins University have documented that life expectancy in Baltimore varies by as much as 20 years between neighbourhoods separated by less than 6 miles, and that the gradient of that variation tracks the HOLC boundaries with startling fidelity. In Richmond, Virginia, the city where the Mapping Inequality Project is housed, the formerly redlined neighbourhoods of Jackson Ward show surface temperatures up to 10 degrees Fahrenheit higher than the formerly green-rated neighbourhoods of the West End. The trees that would have provided shade were never planted because the parks were never funded, because the tax base was never there, because the mortgages were never approved, because the map said red. The causation is traceable. Step by step, dollar by dollar, degree by degree. In Portland, Oregon, a city that did not have a large black population during the HOLC era, the redlined areas along the Albina district show the same environmental and economic signatures as redlined areas in cities 10 times its size. The pattern is not regional, it is structural. The proof is not hidden in archives. It is standing in plain sight, measured in tree rings and asthma rates and median household income. Visible from a satellite, legible from a sidewalk. The maps are digitized now. Anyone can overlay them on a modern aerial photograph and see for themselves how precisely the 1937 boundaries predict the 2024 landscape. The men who coloured those maps in 1935 are long dead. The agency they worked for was dissolved in 1951. The specific policies they created were formally repealed decades ago, and yet the lines they drew are still visible from space in tree cover, in heat signatures, in the sharp gradient between investment and disinvestment that follows boundaries decided before most living Americans were born. The Fair Housing Act made it illegal to say the word. It did not make it possible to undo the math. A family denied a mortgage in 1948 lost not just a house, but a compounding asset over 76 years. Their grandchildren are not starting behind because of a decision made last year. They are starting behind because of a line drawn on a map that was stamped confidential and filed in a cabinet that no one opened for 8 decades. The question that remains is not whether redlining happened, that is documented beyond any reasonable dispute. The question is not whether its effects persist. The data is measured, published, peer-reviewed, and visible to the naked eye. The question, the one that has never been fully answered, the one that every commission and study and legislative hearing circles around but never quite lands on, is simpler than all of that, and harder. If the lines are still there and we can see them and we can measure them and we know exactly how they were drawn and by whom, and for what purpose, what, precisely, is the plan for making them disappear. 89 years of compounding does not reverse itself, and the maps are still readable on every sidewalk in America. The ink dried, the wealth never did.